Hello there, class. This is Dr. Brett Dutton coming to you from Magnolia Creek Baptist Church, the church that I pastor here in League City, Texas. Excited to be with you today for our very first video lecture on the Pentateuch. Today we're going to be talking just a little bit about an introduction as to what the Pentateuch is, and then a lengthy discussion about the authorship of the Pentateuch. Now I need to warn you up front that I have a limited time in this video, and the issue of the authorship of the Pentateuch is a multifaceted, very detailed set of arguments that we're only going to have time to scratch the surface. So hopefully this will pique your interest a little bit, and you'll be encouraged to go and do some more research on it. Okay, well let's dive in here for our Christianity 4381 class and talk about the Pentateuch. Now, the Hebrew title of the first 5 books of the Bible is Torah, which is a word that means law or instruction. The Greek translation of the Old Testament, called the Septuagint, called this book the Pentateuch, which is Greek for fivefold book. You probably said the word penta in there, which means 5. And that points to the idea that the Pentateuch was considered to be really one book with 5 chapters. And of course, we're talking about the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, over the course of the coming weeks, we'll be talking about each one of these books specifically. But this is just an overview of those 5 books and how they came to be called the Pentateuch. Now let's talk about authorship for just a second. And before we jump into this, I just want to make it clear that for centuries, the authorship of the Pentateuch was not questioned. It was generally assumed that Moses was the author of all of the Pentateuch. It's really only been relatively recently that it has come under any kind of great scrutiny, although there were precursors to that. So let's talk about the authorship of the Pentateuch with the rest of our time today. Well, the Jews and the rabbis, they believed from the very beginning that Moses wrote every single word of the Pentateuch. This is confirmed by a couple of early Jewish historians, Philo and Josephus. I have a quote here from Flavius Josephus in one of his apologetic works against Appian. And here he says that we have not an innumerable multitude of books among us, disagreeing from and contradicting one another, but only 22 books. And he's referring to the books that were the 22 Hebrew books of the Old Testament, which contain the records of all past times, which are justly believed to be divine, and of them 5 belong to Moses, which contain his laws and the traditions of the origin of mankind till his death. So again, the early and for many centuries, belief was that Moses was responsible for this. And we do have evidence in the Pentateuch itself that Moses did some writing. We see in Exodus chapter 17, after Israel defeats the Amalekites after leaving Egypt, that the Lord said to Moses, "Write this in a book as a memorial and recite it to Joshua." So we have a specific reference to Moses writing things down here. Exodus 24:4 also refers to Moses writing down all the words of the Lord. So we know that he did some of the writing in the Pentateuch. Then there's evidence that we can look to in the New Testament. Jesus, for instance, in Luke chapter 24, verse 44, this is the story of when Jesus is walking on the road to Emmaus with 2 of his disciples. And he tells them that all the things which are written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. Now here we have a reference to really the three divisions of the Old Testament, the Torah of Moses, the prophets being subdivided into the former and latter prophets, and the Psalms, which he's either referring just to the book of Psalms or he's using that to refer to all of the writings in the writings section or the Ketubim section. Philip in the Gospel of John says to Nathanael, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth." So again, Philip refers to Moses writing the law. Then we have Paul in 1 Corinthians 9:9, who says that it is written in the law of Moses. So you see that both in the Pentateuch itself, other places in the Old Testament that we didn't look at, and even in the New Testament, it is specifically referenced as the law of Moses, the Torah of Moses himself. But then there are a couple of other things that early on led interpreters to suggest that Moses was not the only author of the Pentateuch. For instance, there is no reference to Moses at all in the book of Genesis. Now, he is the prominent character in Exodus forward, but he's not mentioned in Genesis at all. Also, there are certain places that read as if there are two accounts of the same thing. For instance, Genesis 1 and Genesis chapters 2 and 3. They use different names for God. They are in different format. One is poetic in nature. The other is narrative in its form. Genesis 2 and 3 is narrative. You also have things like repeated sections in Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And the question becomes, did Moses write all of these repeated sections? And if he did, why is there repetition the way that there is? There are also things called anachronistic references. In other words, things that refer to a time later than the time of Moses. Now, the most obvious of these is Moses' death. Unless Moses was writing prophetically about his death, and unless he was writing about himself in the third person, then the last few verses of Deuteronomy could not have been written by Moses. There are also references to things that existed that didn't exist during the times of Moses. For instance, there's a reference in Genesis 14:14 to the town of Dan. Well, the town of Dan was not called the town of Dan until after the conquest of Joshua. Up until that time, during the time of Abraham, it's called Laish. Another one of these type of anachronistic references is to the Philistines. Several times in the Pentateuch, there are references to the Philistines. Well, they didn't arrive in Canaan until around 1200 BC, which would have been 1,000 years after Abraham. So it's these sorts of things that caused early scholars and interpreters to say, wait a second, maybe it's possible that Moses was not the sole author of the Pentateuch. And so in later Jewish writings, particularly that writing called the Talmud, which was completed around 200 AD, long after the time of Jesus, the rabbis contended that Moses' death was written by Joshua, but everything else was written by Moses. From the tractate Baba Batra in the Talmud, it says that Moses wrote his own book and the portions of Balaam and Job, but Joshua wrote the book that bears his name and the last 8 verses of the Pentateuch. So, as early as 200 BC, there was a little bit of questioning, but it really wasn't until about 800 years later that the specific questions began, which led to a period of extreme skepticism regarding Mosaic authorship. And the one to really begin that was a Jewish scholar from Spain named Abraham ibn Ezra. And Ibn Ezra was one of the earliest to suggest that there were portions of the Pentateuch beyond his death that could not have been written by Moses. Ibn Ezra wrote in his book of the Straight that if you can grasp the mystery behind these problematic passages in the Pentateuch, the first one being Moses' death, as we just discussed, and then he lists some others, that if you can grasp that Moses didn't write those, then you will understand the truth. So Ibn Ezra was really the first, not really modern scholar, I guess you could say, but the first scholar on this side of 1000 AD to begin the questioning. Well, Ibn Ezra's work was taken up by a Dutch rationalist named Benedict Spinoza. And Spinoza not only took Ibn Ezra's work, but he popularized it and added to it. And he also added to Ibn Ezra's work the fact that any reference to Moses in the third person could not have been written by Moses. He says in his political treatise, "It is clearer than the sun at noonday that the Pentateuch was not written by Moses, but by someone who lived long after Moses." So again, this is in the 1600s, so we're getting closer to the modern period, but we're still a little ways away. And really, more than just question Mosaic authorship, Spinoza was the first to introduce the idea that the history of the Bible is untrustworthy. That to assume that Moses wrote the Pentateuch and believe that that is the truth is actually, and if it's actually wrong, then the entire Bible is untrustworthy. And it's this kind of skepticism that would mark the 17 and 1800s when it came to the authorship of the Pentateuch. So in the 18th century, we have the dawn of the scientific age. And the ideology of science was placed upon really every part of life, including Scripture itself. And so scientists began to challenge other sections of besides the passages in Deuteronomy that we've already noted, to the point of extreme skepticism. And they threw the proverbial baby out with the bathwater, because the argument was, if Moses was considered the author of the Pentateuch for centuries, but you could prove that he really wasn't, then what else had been accepted about the Bible that was not true? And so, unfortunately, it became something of a litmus test about whether or not you believed in the inspiration of Scripture, or really even God himself, if you believed that Moses did or did not write the entire Pentateuch. Well, that takes us to something that has had a huge impact on Old Testament studies, and that's called the documentary hypothesis. You can't read really any commentary on one of the first 5 books of the Old Testament without running into a mention, at least, of the documentary hypothesis, which is also sometimes called source criticism. Now again, source criticism and the documentary hypothesis has a long, detailed history that we don't have time to go into completely, but I do want to at least skim the surface for you. And really, it began with a French medical doctor who was treating Louis XV for leprosy. And Jean Astruc searched Scripture for passages about leprosy, and he created what he called 4 columns, A, B, C, and D. And he began to line up these columns with different passages on leprosy, and he began to notice, and he began to place in these different columns different passages that used different names for God. So in column A, he put all the passages in the Pentateuch that used the name Elohim, the more generic name for God. And in column B, he put all the passages that used the name Yahweh, usually translated the Lord, the personal name of God, in that column. Well, he published his work anonymously simply because it was so controversial at the time in a really long title that is usually just abbreviated conjectures. And this was really the first scientific approach to solving the question of the Pentateuch's authorship. And Ostruc really paved the way for other skeptical scholars and scientists to approach Scripture in this way. Now, at the same time that Ostruc was creating his columns, there was also a man named Erasmus Darwin. You probably recognize his last name. He's the grandfather of Charles Darwin. And in one of his works called Zoonomia, he foreshadowed and laid the groundwork for his grandson's theory of evolution. And you can't really understand the documentary hypothesis without understanding the concept of Darwinism and evolution. Well, the work continued, and a German scholar named Johann Eichhorn concluded that the Pentateuch was composed of two separate sources, kind of building on the work of Ostruc. He called these two sources Jave, which there is no Y in German, so he had to use J instead of Y there, and Elohim. Again, you can see the shades of Ostruc's work here. Well, another monumental work, not just for the field of biblical studies, but really for the field of science, was Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. It was originally published in 1859, and the sixth edition, which was published 13 years later, was the first to use the word evolution. And again, you really can't understand the documentary hypothesis without understanding Darwin's contribution to this, even though it wasn't specifically about biblical studies. Another German scholar who contributed to this was a German theologian named Wilhelm de Wette. And de Wette is the first who identified Deuteronomy as the D source in the documentary hypothesis. We'll come back to that in just a second. De Wette theorized that Deuteronomy was the book of the law found during the reign of King Josiah in 621 BC. You can read in 2 Kings 28 that when Josiah became the king, he instituted a huge set of religious reforms. One of those was to repair the temple. As the temple was being repaired, the priests run across something called the Book of the Law. Now, I actually think that there might be something to this part of the theory, that some or all of Deuteronomy was a separate source that was woven into the framework of the Pentateuch. But this became the documentary hypothesis D source. Well, again, skipping a lot of developments in here and just kind of focusing on the highlights. Another German scholar, Hermann Hupfeld, was the one who identified a fourth source. He split the E document into E1 and E2, and ultimately it was another German scholar, Karl Graf, who labels E2 as P, the priestly document, and he did this in 1865. Now, all of these steps laid the foundation for one of the most important publications in Old Testament studies, for better or worse, ever. And the formal statement of the documentary hypothesis was issued by a German scholar named Julius Wellhausen. And he's often called the father of the documentary hypothesis, which is something of a misnomer because if he was a father, he was an adoptive father, because really he was just building on everything that had happened up to this point that we've already talked about. And his publication, The Prolegomena to the History of Israel, he outlines the classical statement of the documentary hypothesis with regard to the publication or the formation of the Pentateuch. Here is the theory, that the Pentateuch had 4 independent sources or documents behind its formation. These four sources were composed at different times and were eventually woven together over a matter of centuries. And to use a word from Darwin's work, the Pentateuch evolved, that it became something over time. So these four sources are, first of all, the J source, the Yahweh source. According to Wellhausen, this was composed in the southern kingdom of Judah around 850 BC. It used the name Yahweh, which again, there's no Y in German, so they had to use a J. And it emphasized the Abrahamic and Davidic covenants. So every time you see the word Yahweh or the Lord in the Pentateuch, Wellhausen's theory was that the source behind that was the J source. The E source was the Elohim source. This was composed in the north around 750 BC. It used the name Elohim instead of Yahweh for God, emphasized things like the covenant at Sinai, the covenant at Shechem, emphasizing man's responsibility and God's might and God's power. So you've got the J source, you've got the E source, then you have Wilhelm de Wette's D source. And this is some of or all of the book of Deuteronomy. That Deuteronomy existed as its own source, that it was found by the priests in the temple during the reign of King Josiah, and that it was written sometime around 621 BC. So the Deuteronomy itself is its own individual separate source that was tacked on somewhat to the end of the Pentateuch during the formation. The fourth source is the P source, and it was written last around 450 BC. And basically anything in the Pentateuch that refers to priests, Wellhausen concluded came from the P source, dealing with things like worship and sacrifice and the temple. So the Pentateuch started with only the J source and evolved and got larger and larger over time. So you begin with your J source. That's all the Pentateuch was to begin with. Then once the E source was completed, those were combined into one work called JE. And so Wellhausen's theory is that at one point, JE was the Pentateuch around 650 BC. Then the D source is discovered in 621. It's woven together with the J and the E source around 550 BC. And then finally, you've got the P source, written around 450 and woven together with the first three. And so sometimes you will see the documentary hypothesis also called the JEDP theory. And you can see shades of Darwin's idea of evolution here, that the Pentateuch that we have as we have it today, at one point only consisted of J. Then it was JE, then it was JE and D, and then finally JEDP. So what are we to make of all these letters and all these scholars and all of their theories about the Pentateuch evolving over time? Well, I like to try to find something positive and good in every hypothesis or theory. And I think here, with the documentary hypothesis, certainly one of the things that it recognizes is that there are sources that were involved in the composition of the Pentateuch. Some of these sources we may be able to identify, and others we may not be. I mean, is when God told Moses to write in a book, was that one of the sources, or is it the Pentateuch itself? We don't really know. It also acknowledges the fact that there was a human element in the formation of these documents, that God didn't just drop this book out of heaven and it landed on the earth with a thud, but that he inspired individuals, human beings, to sit down and put pen to parchment to write what we have today. However, the documentary hypothesis also tends to be highly objective and arbitrary. I mean, who is to say that the names of God should be the criterion that are used in its formation here. And what about verses where there are multiple names of God used in the same verse? What do you do with something like Genesis 1:3? Because remember, the J document focuses on the Yahweh, name Yahweh, where E focuses on the name Elohim. What about one that says the serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field which Yahweh Elohim had made? Does that go in the J source, or is that attributed to the E source? It also, especially the German scholars, were very skeptical of any supernatural involvement in the Pentateuch's development, believing that this was primarily a work of human beings and that there was no divine inspiration involved. They're also very skeptical about its historicity and whether or not the things that it's saying in the text are actually true. And ultimately, it's more a product of its time than it is anything else. It tells us more about the scientific revolution than it does about Scripture itself. Well, today, for these reasons and for many others, the documentary hypothesis has all but been abandoned by most contemporary scholars. You will still see references to it in many, many works, but for all practical purposes, no one really adheres to it anymore. Most contemporary scholars differentiate between Mosaic influence and Mosaic authorship. It is clear that Moses was the primary figure involved in the composition of the Pentateuch. I mean, you can't escape that simply because you have evidence of him writing. There are numerous places where it's referred to as the Law of Moses. However, it is also likely that there were other authors involved in writing portions of the Pentateuch. If no other section, then certainly the section that refers to his death, and probably some others as well, and that it also shows evidence of editing and revision. Those anachronistic references that we described, those were probably a reference to the time at which the Pentateuch was edited, not to the time at which it was written. So there's clear evidence that, yes, the Pentateuch did undergo an editorial process, but that doesn't mean that it's not divinely inspired. Well, again, that's just a very quick overview of the documentary hypothesis. If this is interesting to you, there are plenty of resources that you can look to read more about it. You can even write your paper on it if you would like to do that toward the end of the semester. Well, I hope that this has been an informative introduction for you, and I look forward to our next session when we will begin to talk about the book of Genesis, chapters 1 through 11. Hope you have a great day. Looking forward to engaging in this class with you. Bye-bye.